I won't read my own introduction. I'll just say a few words about myself. I was a friend of David's, so we worked together. He helped me and the group that I put together called the Jerusalem Working Group to learn these stories and to try to make a difference at Yad Vashem and the other major Holocaust organizations put these kind of stories in the mainstream, which didn't happen. The Jerusalem Working Group, by the way, was set up in honor of the Rabbi Weissmandl and Gizi Fleischmann's working group in Bratislava. I'll say a few words about David, as much as I know about him. Usually we talked about history, but I also learned a little bit about David, a friend, which I think is a great privilege. I also think that he was a tzaddik, really a wonderful man. Open, he also, like you said, shared his knowledge. I remember once he brought over 2 huge folders for me of the Swiss press campaign, which I won't get into. And he lent me cassettes of his interviews with Hillel Kook, with Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld, and I think with somebody else. And he was just a giving person, giving knowledge and help. That's my impression. By the way, these paintings in the back are not here just for the decoration. They're for 2 reasons. One is because David liked art, and I'll speak about that very briefly. And they capture some of David's stories. Most of the figures here were researched by David, except for maybe Hillel Kook, who was researched by David Wyman, Professor David Wyman. The 2 Davids were historical consultants, the Jerusalem Working Group. The paintings, by the way, were painted by a friend of mine called Hanna-Lisa Omer from Slovakia originally. She lived in Jerusalem at the time for one of the events which we organized, for which David flew in, especially from Brooklyn, to speak about George Mantello, this man, and the Swiss people. He thought that that was the most important. He admired Rabbi Weissmandl and many others, Recha Sternbruch, but he repeated many, many times the most important rescue effort which resulted in the most number of lives being saved was by this man, George Mantello, a Hungarian Jew from Romania, the Swiss people whose conscience George Mantello ignited. I won't have the time to go into that. I, by the way, have a meeting next month with the Swiss ambassador, because I'm hoping that at least Switzerland will, also to their advantage, find a way to honor the Swiss people for what they have done for us in the middle of 1944. It was their grassroots uprising, or not uprising, but protests, and their illegal press campaign of 400 glaring headlines about the Holocaust is what created so much noise that in the end, Roosevelt and Churchill and the Pope and the Swedish king really had no choice, and they threatened the regent of Hungary, the fascist Miklos Horthy, which was one of the main factors that stopped the trains from Budapest, where I was at the time as a toddler. Unfortunately, Horthy stopped the transports on July 9th, 1944. That was the day when my grandparents and many of my relatives from my mother's side arrived to Auschwitz and were murdered. So many times I ask if those who didn't help Hillel Kook, didn't help Rabbi Weissmandl, didn't help the Sternbruchs, if they've acted differently, would my grandparents have been murdered or not? Okay, David, as it was said, was a refugee from Germany in the 1930s. Thank God he and his family got out in time. I believe that they lived in Williamsburg initially, because I met at a conference Judah Glick's father, and he remembered him from the neighborhood. David also remembered Professor Robert Almond, the Nobel Prize-winning professor at the university. He remembers various things about Professor Almond when they were kids. David went to Torah Vodaas. I also went there. I was also a refugee from Hungary, much later time, in 1957, after the revolution in Hungary against the Soviets. Hopefully David learned much more than I, through my fault. And he went to Brooklyn College, where he studied the history and art. He was, hopefully it's all right if I say this, Shani. By the way, his daughter Shani Greenwald is with us. He was on the track team, so he's a many-sided individual. I was on the high school and college swimming team, so we had a couple of things in common. Hopefully he was his times when on sprints were better than mine on 100-meter breaststroke or 200 meters, whatever I did. He worked with a printer, I think maybe during college or high school days. And he spoke about it a number of times, that fondness for print, for creativity, for beauty. After Brooklyn College, he went to Columbia, where he learned, I think, library science. Then he went to Brooklyn College again to learn East Asian history, and then he got his doctorate at Yeshiva University on modern Jewish history. He worked as associate professor at Queensborough Community College. Then became a professor and the department head for social science division. He set up the Queensborough Community College Holocaust Archive, and the college is, I think, very close to the 59th Street Bridge in Queens. And then he, from 1988, he was an independent scholar. He traveled frequently to visit various archives and to interview people. As far as I remember, Shani, your father said that you accompanied him sometimes to the Roosevelt Library of the Hudson River, right, to help him copy and to find documents. Amongst the people the many notables who were interviewed, and the interviews are on about 1,000 cassettes in the David Kranzler archive, which is right now at Yad Vashem, not accessible still since 2011. He interviewed in London Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld, one of the great Jewish rescuers, a Talmud of Rabbi Weissmandl. He was involved with the kinder transport, and one of the important things that he did, he was able, because he was very charismatic, he was able to convince many, many parliamentarians and church leaders in England to pass a motion in Parliament that Jews who could get out could find refuge in the British Empire, but it wasn't Palestine. And many of us who were misguided convinced the Parliament not to do this, could damage Zionism. He interviewed Hillel Cook in New York, Peter Bergson. I hope that many of you know who he is. Hillel Cook is this young man over here. He got to New York as a very young man, hardly spoke English. He performed miracles. Like David Bedin said, he worked mostly with the Orthodox and worked with non-Jewish congressmen and senators. Those who came from non-states were very few Jews, because the Jewish establishment felt that Hillel Cook, what he's doing is creating too much noise, it might create anti-Semitism, and in any case you can't save anybody, etc. It was because of Hillel Cook, by the way, and Jewish Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau that in January 1944, Roosevelt, because he had no choice, signed into law establishing the War Refugee Board. According to Professor David Wyman, I don't know how he counted it, but about 200,000 people were saved, mostly Jews. The War Refugee Board is what sponsored the Wallenberg mission to Budapest, by the way. Okay, when David interviewed Hillel Cook, he told me that Hillel Cook was the smartest man, or maybe among the smartest men that he ever met, probably the smartest man. Right away he called up Judy, his wife, and said, Judy, you must come up to Manhattan from Brooklyn. You have to meet this guy. And Judy came to Manhattan, and that's an interesting story, I thought. David also spent a lot of time in Switzerland with George Mantello. I think weeks in Switzerland, to interview him and to learn about his rescue efforts by issuing El Salvador protection papers, which might have been among the first protection papers. And he's the only one who publicized the very famous Auschwitz report, Auschwitz Protocol, which was written after two men, I can't see them here, two men escaped from Auschwitz, Verba and Wetzler. They were debriefed, they got to Bratislava in Slovakia. They were debriefed by the Bratislava Working Group. As a result, a report was written, Auschwitz Protocol. It was disseminated widely to all the who is who in Jewish organizations. Nobody did anything with it. After, unfortunately, too much delay, it reached Mantello through a Romanian diplomat who illegally stopped off in Budapest, received a copy from an Orthodox man called Moshe Kraus. And within 24, and that day when Mantello received that report, he found out that his family was murdered in Romania. Still, the next day, he published an abstract of the atrocities in Auschwitz. That ignited the Swiss people. You see the streets protest. Unions were on the streets, students. In the churches, the Sunday masses were about our brothers and sisters. The leading Swiss theologian, Paul wrote a book immediately called Am I My Brother's Keeper? It sold out immediately. And as I said before, this is what created a tremendous amount of noise that according to David, the title of his book is George Mantello, the man who stopped the trains to Auschwitz and Switzerland's finest hour. It's about time that it's part of what's called Holocaust history, which is not exactly a complete history. The recordings of David's interview, also with Mantello, are at the archive in Yad Vashem in German. David arranged, together with Rabbi Norman Lamb, an honorary PhD for Mantello at Yeshiva University. When Mantello passed away in Switzerland, I believe, David arranged his funeral, just to show what a man she was. Every year, my friends and I organized a day which we call the International Rescuer Day, on the day when Raoul Wallenberg was abducted by the Russians on January 17th. As I said before, David flew in for that event. Also, Wallenberg's niece was there, a friend of ours, to speak about the story, the Swiss story. And just around a day or two before, a few days before that, my sister unfortunately passed away too young. And David knew about that, at all in. Without me saying a word to David, he told me later on that he said Kaddish for my sister the whole year and studied the Mishnah. That's the kind of person that he was. I'd like to say a few words about how we met. If I go on too long, Shani, maybe you let me know that I'm overrunning my time, okay? I was introduced to David by a man called Baruch Tenenbaum, whose statement was read earlier. Baruch is a businessman, a very special man from Buenos Aires, New York, and his operations in Israel. About 20 years ago, he set up an organization called the International Raoul Wallenberg Foundation. We had a number of discussions. I was introduced by a friend who was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and somehow Baruch told me that David is visiting in Israel. I should meet him. There's an interesting story to tell about the Swiss people. And I met David in a hotel lobby in the Crown Plaza, and that's the first time that we met. And my impression was very similar to what you said, that he was a very honest, very frank, a very approachable man, and he told me an incredible story which I had difficulty to really grasp. There's a concept called failure of imagination in technology. People at one time couldn't imagine computers in the home or internet. Well, I had this failure of imagination. I couldn't understand how the Swiss people could just get up and be energized like that. It didn't sound very Swiss to me. I found out later on that David was 100% or 1,000% correct, not 100%. And later on, we were in touch, and then around that time, I started to hear or notice, maybe I heard it before, but all of a sudden it clicked on me that I'm hearing in Israel anti-Semitic statements. One of our really nice person, one of our acquaintances from Europe, once said to me, and I got tears in my eyes, she said, word by word, when I see the Haredim, I understand the Nazis. And I couldn't understand it. This is what I hear in Jerusalem. And I heard many, many other statements like that. And then I started to think, what's going on? Is there something in the secular Israeli culture, or the old Zionist culture that's against the religious Jews or something? And I typed in on Alta Vista or Yahoo, there were some the older search engines before Google became so popular or dominant. There was Zionism and anti-Semitism, just to see if there's any connection there. I knew that there was something called Shlilat HaGalut, but I didn't realize that there are anti-Semitic statements. And then I ended up on two websites, because you never know where you end up when you do a search. One of them was Naturei Karta, and the other one was an anti-Semitic website. And it spoke about a man who I never heard about. Maybe it was a figment of somebody's imagination. That's what I thought at the time, Rabbi Michael Ber Weissmandl. And apparently he wrote very accusing documents about the Zionist movement at the time. And I thought, I was very angry. I said, how can there be such hatred and such propaganda against us? But then I called up David from New York. He was in Brooklyn. And David said that some of these things are sort of true. David always had a problem accusing Jews, saying bad things about Jews. But in the end, because he's an honest historian, he had to tell the truth. He was very careful, and he was very ambivalent about how he expresses things, certainly to me, because he didn't know me at the time. He doesn't know who I am. What am I going to do with the knowledge? And after that, we stayed in touch. I discovered after this person who is not fictional, Rabbi Weissmandl, found that out also. People like Hillel Kook, through David about Mantello, the Sternbruchs, Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld. Another person who we probably didn't hear about, Wilfred Israel, who's in that same category, I think. I call them the Jewish Wallenbergs. So that's about how I met David. Once David invited me to an event, you might remember, Hachnasat Sefer Torah in Telstone. I don't know if David paid for it or he organized it. Probably paid for it, knowing him. It was said that David was a refugee to America, so was I. We didn't say this, but I think that David had the same feeling as I, that just like we say, Anu banu arza livnot velibanot ba, we came to the land to build and to be built by it. We had the same feeling about America as well. I said I didn't come here because of disliking America. It's a different story because I'm a Jew. It's a historical moment for us. But America was good to us. It really were allowed to develop and to contribute. David was very upset, and so was I, about two things. One is an American, I guess, defense contractor, L'Oreal, sold guidance technology to the communist Chinese. And the head of the company was Jewish. He was also upset, and so was I, maybe to a lesser extent than David, that I think Israel sold the Lavi plans to China. So even he had a very strong feeling about Israel, but also he valued what America did for him and for many of us who found refuge there, and opened its doors for us. Getting close to the end, David had many interests, certainly history, certainly art, like I said. I corresponded with his widow, Judy, a few days ago to find out about David's interest in art, etc. So Judy wrote to me that David created copper etchings, and they're included in the group show at the Jewish Museum in New York. He also illuminated the ketubot of his children, I guess he was Shani as well, of his nieces and nephews. And his favorite pastime was modeling in clay. As I said, he was on the track team in college, so I guess also participated in physical activities, stressful activities, not easy to be on a team. He also enjoyed classical music and concerts. Judy wrote that the Kranzler family is very musical. Then I asked Judy, did you and David go to fine art museums? So Judy said, yes, they went to many museums, internationally and in New York, like the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, I guess the Guggenheim, also I guess in England to the Tate Museum, and I asked what about the Louvre. So Judy wrote that they didn't get to the Louvre because David was afraid that Judy won't want to leave because she was a history of art specialist. And I guess David didn't want to be a prisoner of the Louvre, I guess. All right. David has many discussions and debates, some of arguments. For example, we argued about the Swiss people, because David was adamant this was the most important thing, rescue, and I wasn't sure. I said, it's so subjective. We debated, argued about this many times. I think David enjoyed it, and so did I. So enjoyable, like in a chavruta, to speak to somebody who's passionate and wants to find out what the truth is. He had intense curiosity, and he was very perseverance. He researched this topic of rescue by Jews for over 30 years, published over 10 books. His archive was about, I think, over 1 million pages that he collected around the world. That and his audio cassettes are, I think, about 1,000 cassettes at Yad Vashem. I felt that I could always discuss anything with him. He was a mensch, like it was said before. And I guess I'd like to close with the following questions. What did we learn? What did I learn from David? I learned many things. But maybe some most powerful ideas was that unlike what many people said then and say now, because some of the Yad Vashem conference it was said, and I don't see how I could say that, it was not possible to save Jews. After the Shoah, we built our country. David showed, and also David Wyman showed, and the others, few who wrote about this, like Abraham Fuchs, who wrote The Unheeded Cry, the daughter of Weissmandl, that it was possible to save Jews. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews was possible to save. in the current situation where much of the Jewish establishment was not so keen on this project for various reasons. Maybe because of failure of imagination, that's possible to say, but for other reasons as well, unfortunately. David also wrote about these individuals who were not the heads of the World Jewish Congress, not the head of the Joint, not the head of the Sochnut. These are basically amateurs. Each one of them was an amateur. Montello didn't study, he was not the head of an organization of rescue. Rabbi Weissmandel and Gizzi Fleischman were not. Hillel Cook was not. Solomon Schoenfeld was not. These are people who got passionate about something, and they did what's written in Shema Yisrael, B'kol levavcha, b'kol nafshecha, b'kol modecha. They gave everything that they had. They couldn't give more. The organization people were out to lunch. 12 o'clock they were out to lunch, lunchtime in New York, and they were figuratively out to lunch. Because they were not passionate. It was a job. They had a vacation time, they had a pension, they had a corner office with secretaries. Now why is this important? It was important during that time, but I think it's extremely important to learn this lesson now. Because right now, there is a threat against us again, anti-Semitism, which is raising its ugly head. The country where I was born, Hungary, is bringing back, dusting off its old fascist icons, Horthy and some others. There are statues of them near the parliament, based on what my friends are telling me and sending me photos. There's anti-Semitism in the campuses in America, which is unheard of. Now, every 2 years, the Foreign Ministry is organizing a conference called the International Global Conference, or the Global Conference to Combat Anti-Semitism. I went to 2 of them, and they kind of stale, and they're parading the heads of the major Jewish organizations. I don't think too much has come out of it. What's missing again is the inspired activists, the amateurs, the same kind of people, switching subjects, technology. The guys who set up college dropouts, like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, college guys like Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Stanford, or Zuckerman at Harvard. They're not professionals, they're the amateurs. They're the ones who set up these huge empires. So the message must be that during transition times, the amateurs have a tremendous advantage, and there should be some way to learn this lesson for the problems of today. I'm glad that I had an opportunity to organize this event. I'm glad that you came. And about David, we miss him. I certainly miss our many discussions. Yehi Zivro Baruch.